He walked into the office like anyone else, quiet, unassuming, just another employee starting another day. No one asked his name, no one cared. To them, he was invisible, except for one man. The manager was confident and arrogant, with years of power behind him. He didn't need to know who the new guy was. He'd seen it before, another face, another target. In his world it was simple. Those beneath him stayed beneath him. And today the new guy was his next mark. It began with subtle jabs, a smirk, a dismissive wave, then louder insults, sharp, cutting words thrown in front of others. Orders meant to break his spirit. The manager enjoyed every second, sure of his control, confident no one would dare challenge him. To him, the new guy was nobody. But what he didn't realize, that same man he was tearing down, was his new boss. Every insult was being recorded, every cruel word sinking deeper, sealing his own fate. The power he thought he had was slipping away, moment by moment. And yet, the manager kept pushing, unaware that his world was about to collapse. This wasn't just another day at the office. This was the day everything changed. Behind every quiet introduction, there is always more than meets the eye. For this man, the newest face in the company, the reality was far more complex than his colleagues could have guessed. His name was Michael, a highly qualified executive with years of experience leading successful teams. He carried himself with confidence, but there was something else. Kindness, a deep-rooted understanding of people and their struggles. Yet, for these first few days, he chose not to reveal who he really was. He had a reason. Michael wasn't here for the recognition, nor to make a grand entrance. He was here to observe, to understand the culture of this office, and to see how it worked from the ground up. His true role, the new regional director, is someone who could shape the future of the company with a single decision. But no one knew. He moved quietly, interacting with the staff, engaging in casual conversations, and learning the rhythm of the place. His colleagues saw a man who blended in, who asked questions, listened intently, and never revealed too much. They didn't see the weight of the decisions he would soon make. For now, Michael was just another employee. But there was one person who noticed Michael's presence differently. The manager. His name was Richard, an old hand in the company. He had been around for years, rising through the ranks with a mixture of seniority and attitude. He'd learned how to navigate office politics, not through hard work, but through manipulation, arrogance, and, when it suited him, prejudice. Richard was known for targeting employees who didn't fit his view of who should succeed, and more often than not, those employees looked different from him. From the moment Michael entered the office, Richard took note of him, not because he saw a new executive, but because he saw someone he could control, someone he thought didn't belong. Richard's eyes lingered too long, his demeanor shifting whenever Michael was near. It was subtle at first, barely a glance or a comment, but it was enough to send a message. To Richard, Michael wasn't an equal. He was just another person to push around, another target for his silent disdain. Richard held his power like a weapon, always looking for weaknesses, especially in those he considered outsiders. As the days passed, Richard's arrogance grew. He made snide remarks, his voice dripping with condescension. When Michael offered suggestions in meetings, Richard brushed them off with a smirk. His expressions, condescending glances, dismissive nods, were signals to the rest of the office. Michael wasn't someone worth listening to. The small interactions in the break room were no better. Richard's voice was always just loud enough to ensure his sarcasm and disrespect were heard by everyone else. But here's the thing. Michael didn't react. Not the way Richard expected him to. The quiet professionalism in Michael's demeanor only frustrated Richard more. How could this man remain so calm, so collected in the face of insults? Richard expected submission, or at the very least, irritation. But what he got was silence. And that silence, it was unnerving. The stakes were growing by the day, the tension thickened. Because while Richard felt confident in his control, Something lingered in the air that he couldn't understand. Michael wasn't just another employee, and while Richard played his petty power games, Michael was watching. Every word, every dismissive action was noted, filed away. Michael saw not only how Richard treated him, but also how others in the office reacted. The co-workers who stayed silent looked away. The unspoken rules that governed how Richard treated those he saw as less. For Michael, this wasn't just a job anymore. It was becoming personal. He knew that soon the truth would come out, that his position, his real authority, would shake this office to its core. But for now, he remained quiet, watching, waiting. The weight of what would come was heavy but necessary. Because the moment Richard discovered who Michael truly was, everything in this office would change. As the days unfolded, Richard's behavior became more blatant. The subtle jabs from before, they were now outright insults, spoken with confidence and an audience. It started small, just enough to humiliate, but not enough for anyone to step in. But it never stayed small for long. Michael, still seen as just another employee, was given tasks beneath his skill set, demeaning jobs that others noticed but said nothing about, organizing files, fetching coffee, cleaning up after meetings. Richard made sure everyone saw it, that everyone knew their place. For Richard, it was about control, exerting power over someone he assumed could do nothing about it. His prejudice was never hidden, and his words carried the weight of years of unchecked authority. It was a team meeting. The room was filled with colleagues, all silently going through the motions. Richard stood at the front running the meeting, his voice steady, authoritative. "Michael," Richard said, his voice carrying across the room, "could you get the team some coffee and maybe clean up this mess? This is hardly work for the rest of us." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room, but no one said a word. Michael, in that moment, didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't even look angry. He simply nodded, calmly stepping out to do as asked. It wasn't the request that stung. It was the way it was done. The laughter that followed, the nods of approval Richard received. At that moment, to the rest of the team, Michael was reduced to a servant, his expertise, his experience erased by one command. Over time, Richard grew bolder. The insults became more pointed, more direct. He no longer bothered hiding behind sarcasm. "Michael," he'd say loud enough for others to hear, "you people don't really get how things work here, do you?" No one spoke, no one challenged him, and Michael again said nothing. But his silence wasn't a weakness. It wasn't fear. He was watching. He was waiting. With every cruel word Richard spat, Michael grew more certain of what he had to do. Richard, though, mistook Michael's silence for submission. He didn't realize that Michael was biding his time, waiting for his true authority to be revealed. The breaking point came one afternoon when Richard assigned Michael a task so degrading that even the other employees were uncomfortable. In front of the entire team, Richard handed Michael a pile of documents to sort. Menial, irrelevant tasks that had no purpose but to humiliate. "You can handle this, right? I mean, you must be used to working with your hands," Richard sneered, his voice filled with disdain, a racially charged insult that everyone in the room understood. A silence filled the space. All eyes turned to Michael, waiting for a reaction, waiting for him to finally snap, to finally say something, to fight back. But Michael didn't snap. He took the documents and quietly walked to his desk. The room buzzed with tension, whispers and stolen glances as everyone waited for what would happen next. Day after day, Richard's arrogance grew, and still, Michael remained calm. He executed every humiliating task with quiet precision. To everyone around him, it looked like submission, like defeat. But Michael wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. Each insult was fuel for something bigger. The team was starting to wonder, why? Why wasn't he standing up for himself? Why did he keep taking the abuse? What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that Michael was preparing. Because Michael knew that the time would soon come when everything Richard thought he controlled would fall apart. And when that moment came, Michael wouldn't need to say a word. The truth would speak for itself. And then the day finally came. It was like any other day in the office. The usual hum of work, conversations in hushed tones, phones ringing, emails being sent. Michael, still the quiet observer, went about his tasks. But today, something was different. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface for weeks was about to reach its boiling point. A message appeared in Michael's inbox, a meeting with senior management, a regular occurrence for some, but for Michael, this would be the moment that changed everything. Richard, of course, was in attendance. He sat confidently at the table, laughing with his colleagues, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Michael walked into the room, calm as always, but this time there was something different in his presence. He took his seat among the others, his face composed, his movements deliberate. The meeting began as usual, updates on performance, business strategies, and the usual back and forth between executives. And then, without warning, the conversation shifted. The senior manager turned to Richard. "Richard," he began, "I'd like to introduce you to someone officially. You've had the pleasure of working with him these past few weeks, but there's something important you need to know." The room fell silent. Richard's smirk faded slightly, his confidence shaken just a bit. He turned to Michael, waiting, though he still didn't understand what was happening. "Michael," the senior manager continued, "isn't just a new hire. He's the new regional director, your new boss." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Time seemed to slow in that moment. The entire room froze, every pair of eyes fixed on Richard, waiting for his reaction. And Richard? He was speechless. His face, once filled with arrogance and superiority, is now drained of color. Confusion clouded his eyes, followed by disbelief, and finally, the creeping realization of everything that had just crumbled beneath him. Richard, a man who had spent weeks tearing Michael down, was now face to face with the reality he couldn't have imagined. The man he had belittled, insulted, and humiliated wasn't just another employee. He was his superior. And for the first time, Richard was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with awkwardness, the weight of the reveal pressing down on everyone in the room. Richard's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he justify everything he had done? Finally, it was Michael who broke the silence, but not with anger or resentment. He spoke calmly, his voice steady, and addressed the room. "Thank you," Michael said, turning to the senior staff, "for the opportunity to observe the company in this way. It's been enlightening." His words were measured and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His authority was clear. "Moving forward," he continued, "there will be changes in how we treat each other, in how we respect one another." He let his words sink in, his eyes never leaving Richard's. Richard, still reeling from the shock, looked down at the table, unable to meet Michael's gaze. The room remained silent, everyone waiting for what would happen next. Would Richard apologize? Would he try to explain himself? But he didn't. For once, Richard, the man who always had something to say, had no words. And Michael? He didn't push further. He let the silence speak. There was nothing more that needed to be said. As the meeting came to a close, the tension remained, thick and palpable. Richard, still visibly shaken, quietly excused himself and left the room without a word. The rest of the team stayed seated, unsure of how to react, but Michael stood, gathering his things calmly and walking out of the room with the same grace he'd carried since day one. The power shift had happened, but not with a grand display, not with anger or revenge. Michael had revealed his position and let Richard's actions condemn him. In the end, it wasn't about vengeance, it was about setting the tone for a new culture, a new way forward. The reveal wasn't just about Richard, it was about the entire company, a moment where everyone was forced to confront not just Richard's actions, but their silence. The moment of truth had arrived, and the lesson was clear. The power we think we have is fragile, and the way we treat others, especially those we think have no power, will always come back to us. So what would you have done? If you were in Richard's shoes, or in Michael's, what would you have said? Would you have reacted differently? Let us know in the comments, how would you have handled the situation? Have you ever witnessed something like this? What would you have done if you were Richard? And if you were Michael, would you have stayed quiet? The reveal had passed, but the consequences of Richard's actions lingered in the air. His authority, once so assured, had crumbled in front of everyone. And now, in the days that followed, the office itself began to change. People who had once turned a blind eye to his behavior couldn't ignore it anymore. What they had once accepted as normal, the subtle microaggressions, the belittling comments, the quiet power plays, was now exposed for what it truly was. The question now wasn't just about Richard. It was about the entire culture of the workplace. How had they let it go on for so long? And what would happen now that the truth was out? Delbord. Richard arrived at the office the next day, but the air was different. His once confident stride had slowed. The swagger in his voice was gone. People avoided eye contact. Some glanced at him out of the corner of their eyes, unsure of how to interact with a man whose power had evaporated overnight. He felt the weight of their judgment. People who had once followed his lead now distanced themselves, their silence speaking volumes. For the first time, Richard felt what it was like to be on the other side. He couldn't escape the uncomfortable truth. His authority had never been real. It had been built on fear, prejudice, and treating people as less than they were. And now, with Michael's reveal, it was all falling apart. The shame lingered heavy on his shoulders as he sat at his desk, no longer the one in control. Meanwhile, Michael had stepped into his role as the new regional director with the same calm professionalism he had shown all along. There was no celebration, no gloating over Richard's downfall. Michael knew that leadership wasn't about revenge. It was about setting an example for everyone else in the office. One day, Michael called Richard into his office. It was the moment Richard had been dreading, the moment he feared would end his career. He walked in, his steps hesitant, no longer filled with the same confidence that had once dominated the office. Michael greeted him with the same calmness, the same quiet authority. "Have a seat," Michael said. There was no anger in his voice, no resentment, just the professionalism that Richard had never shown him. Richard sat, unsure of what was coming next. Michael could have taken this moment to strike back, to put Richard in his place, to embarrass him in front of everyone the way Richard had tried to humiliate him. But he didn't. That wasn't Michael's way. Instead, he addressed the issue head-on, with the professionalism that had defined him since day one. "Richard," Michael began, his voice steady, "we both know what's been happening over the past few weeks. The way you've treated me and others hasn't gone unnoticed. But I'm not here to retaliate. I'm here to talk about moving forward." Richard sat quietly, his eyes downcast. He knew there was no defense for his behavior, no excuse that could erase what he had done. "This office," Michael continued, "needs to change, and it starts with accountability. What's happened can't be undone, but what matters now is what we do next. I'm giving you a choice. You can either learn from this and commit to being part of the change we need, or you can step aside." The words hung in the air, leaving Richard with a decision he hadn't expected. This wasn't about punishment, this was about growth. While Richard struggled internally, the rest of the office was also changing. Employees who had once tolerated or even supported Richard's behavior began to reflect on their own silence. Some realized they had enabled his behavior by staying quiet, by looking the other way. Others began to speak out, realizing that the office didn't have to be defined by fear and prejudice anymore. Michael's leadership was different. He didn't lead with fear or control. He led with respect, and the rest of the office noticed. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Co-workers who had once kept their heads down during Richard's bullying now spoke more freely, knowing they wouldn't be silenced or dismissed. There was a new energy in the office, a sense of accountability, of respect that hadn't been there before. People started to listen to one another, to treat each other as equals, regardless of their background or their position. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was real. The dynamics of the office had shifted, and with it, a new culture was emerging, one where people felt safe, where respect wasn't just a word thrown around in meetings, but a value lived out every day. There was one final moment, Richard's internal struggle. Days had passed since his conversation with Michael, and the weight of it all still pressed on him. He sat alone in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened, the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had squandered by letting his prejudice dictate his actions. For the first time, Richard was forced to confront himself, not as the manager who once held power, but as a man who had lost his way. And in that moment of reflection, something shifted. Richard had a choice. He could either continue down the path of bitterness and arrogance, or he could grow. He could apologize. He could make amends. The question wasn't whether he would be forgiven. The question was whether he was willing to change. Because real leadership isn't about power, it's about respect, and respect had to be earned. In the end, this wasn't just a story about one man's prejudice or another's quiet strength. It was a lesson in the importance of respect in the workplace and in life. It was a reminder that no matter our position, our background, or our power, the way we treat others will always come back to us. The true measure of a leader isn't found in how much control they have, but in how much respect they give. And in this office, respect wasn't just earned, it was rebuilt, one interaction at a time. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a situation like this? How do you think Richard handled it? Could he have done more? What would you have done in Michael's shoes or in the shoes of the other employees? The storm had passed. The office, once a place where fear and prejudice quietly dictated the rules, had transformed. Michael, now fully established in his role as the new regional director, had done more than just take charge. He had built something new. Under his leadership, the workplace became a place where respect wasn't earned through power or status, but given freely to everyone, no matter their background, role, or position. The changes didn't happen overnight, but day by day, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. Where once silence met Richard's bullying, now voices spoke up. Where once teamwork was undermined by fear of hierarchy, now collaboration thrived. Michael had established a workplace that didn't just tolerate differences, it embraced them. Michael's vision for the office wasn't just about doing the job. It was about creating a space where people could feel valued, where each person's contribution mattered. He promoted respect, equality, and inclusion, but not just through words. He led by example, showing that true leadership is built on empathy, not ego. Richard, too, had changed. He was no longer the arrogant manager who controlled through fear. After his conversation with Michael, something in him shifted. He stayed on in the company, but as a different man. He had taken Michael's offer, not just to keep his job, but to learn, to grow, and to rebuild the respect he had lost. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate. But over time, Richard worked to regain the trust of his colleagues. He listened more. He spoke less. He learned that leadership wasn't about dominance, but about accountability and respect for those around him. Richard's journey wasn't about redemption through words, but through actions. He learned that forgiveness isn't given lightly. It has to be earned. And in the end, he began to understand the power of humility, the importance of accountability, and the value of treating everyone with respect. As weeks turned into months, the culture of the office flourished. Employees who had once felt silenced found their voices again. Those who had felt marginalized now felt empowered, And under Michael's leadership, the company thrived, not just in numbers, but in spirit. People looked out for each other. They worked together as equals, not just casual workers. The transformation was clear. This wasn't just a company. It was a community, a place where people were valued for who they were, not just the work they did. Michael's influence had left a lasting mark on the office, showing that true success comes not from domination, but from mutual respect and understanding. The themes of growth, forgiveness, and accountability wove through every corner of the office. Michael's quiet strength and leadership had shown everyone what was possible when you lead with compassion. The forgiveness Richard sought didn't come immediately, but it came through his efforts to change. And the accountability everyone shared in creating a better workplace ensured that the lessons learned wouldn't be forgotten. But this isn't just a story about one office. It's a story that resonates with many of us. Have you ever been in a situation like this? Have you witnessed or experienced discrimination or seen someone use their power in the wrong way? How did you handle it? What would you have done in Michael's shoes? And more importantly, how can we all work together to create more inclusive, respectful environments in our own lives? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might just inspire someone else to take a stand for what's right. At the end of the day, the way we treat others defines the spaces we create. Michael didn't just change the office by stepping into his role. He changed it by showing that real leadership isn't about power, but about respect. And in the end, that respect changed everything. Stories like these don't just happen in one office. They happen all around us every day. The way we treat others can shape entire communities, workplaces, and lives. Now that you've heard this story, we want to hear from you. Do you think Richard deserved forgiveness, or should he have faced stricter consequences for his actions? What would you have done in Michael's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. Your insights and experiences can help create change. And if you've ever witnessed or experienced something like this, we want to hear your story. If you found this story impactful, be sure to like the video and share it with others. Together, we can spread awareness about the importance of respect and equality in all aspects of life. Like this video, hit the thumbs up and share. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories that challenge us to think deeper, act with compassion, and make the world a little better. And if you thought this story was powerful, you won't want to miss what's coming next. We'll be diving into another real-life story, another pressing issue. It's a story that will challenge what we think we know and inspire change. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. We're committed to telling real stories that matter, and we'd love for you to be a part of this journey with us. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more thought-provoking stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, change starts with how we treat each other. See you in the next video.